The flight was packed, that typical journey where every centimeter of space counts, where people try unsuccessfully to pretend they're not squeezed together like sardines in a can. The atmosphere inside the plane was already heavy even before takeoff. Impatient passengers trying to fit their luggage into the overhead compartment, restless children, and that inevitable smell of suspicious snacks coming from some clandestine lunchbox. But none of this compared to the real spectacle of the evening. A woman who simply refused to accept that the world didn't revolve around her. The confusion began even before the plane left the runway. The woman, blonde, wearing a very expensive blazer and the look of someone who has clearly threatened to sue at least 3 waiters in the last week, stopped next to a man's seat and simply declared, without the slightest trace of doubt in her voice, "You need to change places with me." The man, a gentleman in his 50s, looked at her with that classic, "I just wanted to get to my destination without having to interact with anyone" expression and replied calmly, "Excuse me, but that's my seat." The woman gave a tense little smile, one of those that hides a fury worthy of a Mexican soap opera. She looked around, hoping that a flight attendant would intervene on her behalf. Nothing. So she tried again, but now with a more aggressive stance. "My husband is sitting up front and I have to sit next to him. Is that a problem for you?" It was the kind of tone that didn't sound like a request, but rather like an order disguised as politeness. Except the man didn't seem the type to give in easily. He just went back to looking at his book and completely ignored her existence. And that's when everything started to get out of hand. First, the woman snorted loudly. Then she started grumbling about the lack of empathy in people today. As no one reacted, she went up a level on the drama scale. She started talking about her rights as a passenger, said that the in-flight service should sort out this nonsense, and threatened to call a lawyer as soon as they landed. Until, in a fit of rage, she crossed her arms and in a tone of defiance let out for the whole row to hear, "Then no one will sit here." And she threw herself into the empty seat next to the man, occupying both seats as if she had paid for them. Now, if there was anyone on that plane who wasn't already paying attention to the scene, this moment definitely guaranteed a full audience. From the back of the plane, a young woman with a baby strapped to her chest slowly made her way forward. She had been watching the scene unfold with growing concern. This was Maya, a pediatric nurse traveling alone with her 6-month-old son after visiting her dying mother. She had spent the last of her savings on this ticket and couldn't afford any delays or cancellations. "Excuse me," Maya said quietly, approaching the flight attendant who was now heading toward the commotion. "I really need this flight to take off on time. My son has medication I need to give him when we land, and we can't afford to miss our connection." The flight attendant nodded sympathetically, but was clearly focused on the bigger problem at hand, the blonde woman who was now sprawled across 2 seats that weren't hers. The flight attendants, who until then had been trying to ignore the situation to avoid an unnecessary explosion of stress before takeoff, finally intervened. One of them approached, forced a professional smile, and explained that the lady couldn't simply occupy a seat that wasn't hers. But if there's one thing certain types of people hate more than being contradicted, it's being contradicted in public. The woman, already red with anger, refused to leave. "I have the right to be here." Of course, because apparently there were now rights of possession over other people's seats, just because you want that seat so badly. The flight was about to be delayed, and the tension inside the plane was already palpable. Passengers rolled their eyes. Some people started discreetly recording with their cell phones, and the flight attendants were clearly one step away from throwing one of those forced smiles in the trash and simply dragging her off by her feet. Maya bounced her fussing baby nervously. "Please," she whispered to no one in particular, "we can't miss this flight." An older gentleman sitting nearby overheard her. "Is everything okay, dear?" "My son has a rare condition," Maya explained quietly. "I have medication that needs to be refrigerated waiting at our destination. If we miss this flight—" Her voice trailed off, the implications clear. The older man's face hardened as he looked back at the blonde woman causing all the trouble. It was at this point that the pilot was called, and well, it was clear that he wasn't in the mood to deal with yet another diva show. The man emerged from the back of the plane, tall, imposing, with that impeccable uniform and the look like he'd seen it all and wasn't going to tolerate another drop of stupidity that day. He approached the scene of the crime, and with the deadly calm of someone who had foreseen exactly how it would end, crossed his arms. "Madam, we need you to return to your seat immediately so that we can take off." She, who until then had thought she was in control of the situation, turned to face him and tried to maintain her pose. "But I have the right to sit here." The pilot arched an eyebrow. "Do you?" The silence in the plane was so deep that you could hear gum being chewed in row 26. And then, with the calmness of an executioner about to sign someone's sentence, he simply said, "All right, so if you don't get up now, I'm going to have to ask you to be removed from the plane." From the way the woman's eyes widened, it was clear that this part of the script had not been foreseen in her great mental theater. The passengers, on the other hand, were about to order popcorn. Maya's baby started crying, the tension in the cabin finally getting to him. The sound seemed to break the spell momentarily as all eyes turned toward the distressed infant. "Now look what you've done," the blonde woman snapped, glaring at Maya. "Can't you control your child? Some of us are trying to resolve an important issue here." A collective gasp went through the cabin. Even those who had been merely annoyed by the woman's behavior now looked genuinely outraged. Maya's face flushed with embarrassment and anger as she tried to soothe her baby. The older gentleman who had spoken to Maya earlier stood up. "Ma'am," he said, addressing the blonde woman with ice in his voice, "that young mother has more important concerns than your imagined seat rights. Her child needs medical attention at their destination, and you're delaying an entire aircraft full of people because you can't follow simple instructions." "Stay out of this," the blonde woman hissed. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," came another voice, a businesswoman from across the aisle. "We're all going to be late because of you." The woman remained static, her eyes popped slightly out of their sockets, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. This was not what was supposed to be happening. In her mind, the pilot should have been on her side, perhaps even forcing the man to give up his seat just to avoid a bigger scene. But no, instead, she was now face to face with someone who wasn't going to fall for her emotional blackmail. The passengers were paying attention. The man next to her, still holding his book, was completely impassive, as if he were watching a live episode of a reality TV show. Some were already discreetly holding up their cell phones, ready to immortalize that moment on video. I'm a paying customer," she suddenly exploded, pointing her finger at the pilot as if that were enough to invalidate the entire hierarchy of the universe. The pilot remained impassive. "And so is everyone here," he replied with a tone of boredom, making a broad gesture with his hand. The buzz on the plane grew. The woman looked around, searching for allies, but only found expressions of pure delight and morbid curiosity. It was as if everyone there was rooting for the same outcome. Maya's baby had quieted down, now sucking his thumb and watching the scene with wide, innocent eyes. The contrast between his innocence and the woman's behavior wasn't lost on the other passengers. The pilot sighed. "Madam, this is the last time I ask. If you don't return to your original seat now, we will have to remove you from the aircraft." And that's when the magic happened. The woman, who up until that moment had only been throwing a tantrum, suddenly found a new level of audacity. Her face turned red, her lips trembled with rage, and in a theatrical move, she threw her bag on the seat next to her and crossed her arms, planting her feet on the floor like a stubborn child who has decided that she won't leave the mall without a new toy. "I demand to speak to someone higher up." The silence that followed was so profound that for a moment, all that could be heard was the faint hum of the cabin air conditioning. The pilot blinked slowly, processing those words. "Ma'am, I'm the superior here." The muffled laughter of someone in the back row echoed. A flight attendant covered her mouth, trying to hide a small smile. The pilot, for his part, showed no emotion. He just turned to one of the flight attendants and in an absolutely neutral tone said, "Call the security team." And that was that. That's when all hell broke loose. The woman's eyes widened, and she jumped to her feet as if someone had shouted fire on the plane. "What? Are you going to throw me out?" Her voice rose several octaves, so high-pitched that it was capable of piercing the eardrum of an unsuspecting elderly person. The pilot didn't answer. He simply turned on his heels and started walking towards the cockpit. Now, anyone who has ever dealt with someone who is very spoiled knows that this is the worst kind of response you can give. Silent contempt is a punch to the ego, and of course, the woman wasn't going to accept that without one last card. She picked up her bag, slammed it down on the seat next to her, and turned to the row of passengers behind her. "Can you see that? You're treating me like a criminal." No one answered. On the contrary, a lady in the aisle seat just smiled sweetly and went back to reading her magazine, as if she were watching a scene that had happened a million times before. The woman became even angrier. "This airline is going to regret this. I'm going to put you out of business," which was a ridiculously exaggerated promise, given that all the airline was doing was preventing a lunatic from hijacking a seat that wasn't hers. Maya, still holding her baby, caught the eye of the flight attendant. "Is there anything I can do to help?" she whispered. "I'm a nurse. Maybe I could talk to her." The flight attendant shook her head. "Thank you, but it's best to let security handle this. We don't want to escalate the situation." A few minutes later, an airport security agent appeared at the entrance to the plane. A stout, serious man with a vest that said Airport Security, and the look of someone who had dealt with a lot of clueless tourists. He approached the woman and said something quietly in a professional and controlled tone. And that's when she made her final move. Tears. Oh yes, because when nothing else works, when all the doors close, when logic fails and stubbornness bears no fruit, along comes the ultimate trick. She took a deep breath, and like magic, the tears came. I just wanted to sit next to my husband. Is that so hard to understand?" She sobbed loudly, throwing her hair back as if she were the victim of a historical atrocity. But now it was too late. The security officer showed no compassion. He simply reached for the radio on his belt and said something that made her turn pale. "Okay, we're removing passenger from the flight." The woman's reaction was worthy of an acting award. "What? But this is absurd. You can't do that to me." Oh, but they could, and they were going too. The passengers were vibrating. Some were trying to hold in their laughter, others were looking expectantly, and one guy too rose back, made a gesture as if he was eating invisible popcorn. The security officer stepped forward and made a polite but firm gesture for her to follow him. "Ma'am, please, let's go." The woman hesitated. It seemed that at that moment, her brain finally understood that she wasn't going to win this one. "But my husband." The pilot, who had returned to observe the scene, shrugged. "The lady's husband can choose whether to stay or leave with you." All eyes turned to the husband, who was sitting 2 rows ahead. The man seemed to be having a very serious internal debate about whether it was really worth risking his flight and his vacation over this nonsense. Then something unexpected happened. Maya, with her baby still in her arms, stood up and addressed the husband directly. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude, but your wife's behavior is delaying a plane full of people. My son needs medical attention when we land. Please, if you could help resolve this situation." The husband's face reddened with embarrassment. He glanced at his wife, then at Maya and her baby, then at the sea of judgmental faces surrounding him. He seemed to be processing the reality of the situation for the first time, seeing his wife through the eyes of strangers. In the end, he did something no one expected. He didn't move. The woman looked at him, shocked, as if she expected him to jump out of his seat, shouting, "My love, I will save you." But nothing. "Richard," she called out, her voice now tinged with genuine surprise rather than manufactured drama. "Richard, tell them they can't do this." Richard looked down at his lap, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Just go with the officer, Hoa. I'll see you when I get back." The collective gasp that went through the cabin could have depressurized the aircraft. The woman's husband, her supposed ally and reason for this entire debacle, had just abandoned her to her fate. And with that, the battle finally came to an end. The agent took a firm hold of the woman's arm and began to escort her out. "Richard, you're choosing them over me. Richard." Her screeches echoed through the cabin as she was pulled toward the exit. "After everything I've done for you, you're going to let them treat me like this." The husband sank lower in his seat, his face now buried in his hands. The passengers held their breath as she was led off the plane, and then, as soon as she disappeared from the cabin, came the historic moment. Someone clapped their hands, then someone else, and in the blink of an eye, the whole plane was applauding. The pilot smiled slightly and just gave a discreet wave to the passengers. "Thanks for your patience, everyone. Now we can take off." And that's how a flight that was supposed to be just another trip turned into a spectacle worthy of being told about. When the woman was finally taken off the plane, there was that moment of pure collective ecstasy, the kind of relief that only happens when a major nuisance is removed from the environment and everyone can breathe again. But she hadn't given up yet. Outside the aircraft, in the finger corridor, the woman was still wailing, screaming, and trying to convince any available authority that she was the victim of that absurd situation. The security agent wasn't impressed in the slightest. He must have dealt with so many airport shambles that this was just another ordinary day at work. "Ma'am, you are being removed from this flight and will be taken to the airline counter to resolve your situation." The woman hissed, indignant. "You can't do this to me. I have rights." By now, boarding had finished and the gate was closed. Inside, the plane was preparing to taxi to the runway, but outside, she still insisted on trying to turn the tables. "I demand that the company's supervisor be brought in now." The security agent crossed his arms and replied without even blinking. "Ma'am, you no longer have a flight to catch." That sentence hit her like a brick. Her mouth dropped open slightly, as if her brain was finally starting to process the weight of reality. She had missed her flight. She wasn't going to make it to her destination. And to make matters worse, her husband hadn't left with her. In fact, no one had gotten off. No passengers stood up in solidarity. No charitable soul rushed to her side, offering support or saying that it was unfair. Nothing. She was alone, standing there, being treated like the nuisance she really was. That's when the final blow came. An airline attendant approached and, with a professional smile trained to deal with unbearable customers, handed her a piece of paper. "Here is the form to rebook your flight, ma'am. Unfortunately, there will be a fee for rebooking." Absolute silence. If this were a movie, that would be the moment when the music suddenly stopped, and the camera zoomed in on the main character's face to capture her look of pure horror. "What?" she managed to say, almost choking. The attendant, impassive, simply repeated, "As you were removed from the flight for refusing to follow the crew's instructions, any rebooking will be at an additional cost." The woman blinked a few times, trying to absorb what was happening. "You're charging me for this." By now, half the airport staff were standing nearby, watching the spectacle from their boxes. The attendant kept her composure. "Yes, ma'am. In addition, your checked baggage will continue on to its original destination, as the flight cannot be interrupted for baggage claim at this time." Another knock. The woman turned pale. "You sent my suitcase on the flight without me." "Exactly, ma'am. You can retrieve it at the final destination or have it sent back to this airport, but there are additional fees for that too." That was the trigger. The woman spread her arms as if she was about to conjure up a lawsuit out of thin air. "This is theft. I'm taking this company down. I'll sue everyone here." But now no one else was paying attention. The security agent exchanged a bored look with the attendant and simply nodded for her to deal with it as she saw fit. And the attendant, already used to customers threatening to sue even the airport pigeons, just shrugged and handed over a card. "Here is the contact information for the airline's legal department. If you want, you can contact them directly." The woman snatched the card from her hand, shaking with anger, but didn't reply. For the first time since this soap opera began, she was completely speechless. No flight, no suitcase, and now no dignity. Meanwhile, inside the plane, the mood was one of pure celebration. After a considerable delay, the pilot finally got back on the internal communication system to talk to the passengers. "Everyone, We thank you for your patience. Now that the situation has been resolved, we're ready for takeoff." The whole plane erupted in applause. It was the kind of moment when passengers, normally tired and angry, suddenly felt part of a community, united by a common experience. Public enemy number one had been defeated. The man in the original seat could finally return to his peace, and now he even looked a little satisfied. Some people were still muttering about the spectacle they had just witnessed, while others were frantically texting friends and family to tell them what had happened. Maya, the nurse with the baby, received special attention from the flight attendants, who made sure she was comfortable and even upgraded her to a seat with more space for her and her child. The older gentleman who had spoken up for her came by to check on her. "Thank you for saying something," Maya told him. "I was so worried we wouldn't take off on time." "No need to thank me," he replied. "Some people need to learn they're not the center of the universe." A woman in the middle row turned to her husband and whispered, "I knew this flight would be interesting." He just nodded, still laughing. And then the plane began to move down the runway. A sense of anticipation filled the cabin, the slight trembling of the wheels, the roar of the engines intensifying, the acceleration that made everyone sink into their seats a little, and finally, take off. As the aircraft rose, leaving the ground behind, people began to relax. Now it was official. The drama was behind us, along with the woman who should never have caused all that fuss. The flight went smoothly. Stewards started serving drinks, passengers put on headphones or opened books, and for a while everything seemed normal. But there was one more twist to this story that no one saw coming. About halfway through the flight, Richard, the husband who had chosen to stay on the plane, began to look increasingly uncomfortable. He fidgeted in his seat, checked his phone repeatedly despite the airplane mode, and kept glancing anxiously toward the front of the plane. Finally, he stood up and made his way to where Maya was sitting with her now sleeping baby. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. I wanted to apologize for my wife's behavior. She's been going through a difficult time, but that's no excuse for how she treated everyone, especially you and your child." Maya looked up at him, surprised. "Thank you for saying that. It can't be easy for you either." Richard shook his head. "It's been a challenging marriage. Today might have been the wake-up call I needed." He hesitated, then added, "If there's anything you need when we land, please let me know. I'd like to help make up for the delay she caused." This small moment of humanity didn't go unnoticed. Several nearby passengers who had been eavesdropping nodded approvingly. Perhaps not everyone associated with the villain of their story was a villain themselves. But of course, that wasn't the end of the story. Because when the plane landed at its final destination, there was one small detail that no one had thought of yet. The woman might even have been kicked off the flight, but her suitcase had arrived at its destination. And guess who would be waiting to pick it up at the airport? That's right. And she certainly wasn't going to accept that without one last fight. The flight passed in pure peace, a real miracle after the horror show that had taken place before takeoff. The passengers finally relaxed, enjoyed what was left of the trip. But like any good drama, the story wasn't over yet, because as that plane approached its final destination, one small detail kept hanging in the air like a storm about to break. The woman's suitcase had been checked in normally and was on its way to the airport, waiting to be retrieved by someone who at the moment was miles away and probably shouting at some unlucky employee at the airport of origin. As soon as the plane landed and the passengers began to disembark, everyone was still talking about the big event of the flight. Some were laughing, others were already on the phone telling the story to friends and family. "I swore this woman was going to throw herself on the floor and make a fuss before she left," muttered one man to his wife as they picked up their bags from the luggage conveyor belt. But the real spectacle was about to happen. The moment the woman's suitcase appeared on the conveyor belt, imposing, full of tags and probably containing expensive clothes and a stash of pure hatred inside, an airport official approached. He glanced at the luggage code, then looked around, hoping that someone would come forward to pick it up. But of course, the owner of the suitcase wasn't there. After all, she had been kicked off the flight on the other side of the country. So technically, her suitcase was now an international orphan. The airport staff started talking to each other, trying to figure out what to do. After all, unaccompanied baggage usually had to be checked in and stored until the owner showed up. To everyone's surprise, Richard approached the baggage carousel. "That's my wife's suitcase," he said quietly to the airport official. "I should probably take it." The official looked at him skeptically. "Are you traveling together, sir?" Richard hesitated. "We were supposed to be, she was, removed from the flight." A flash of recognition crossed the official's face. "Ah, you're the husband of the woman who—" "Yes," Richard cut him off, his face flushing. "That's me." Maya, who had been waiting nearby for her own luggage, overheard the exchange. She stepped forward, her baby now awake and looking around with curious eyes. "He's telling the truth," she confirmed to the official. "His wife was the one who caused the delay." The official looked between them, clearly trying to decide what to do. Then came the final touch of irony. While the employees were analyzing the situation, one of them received an alert on the system and frowned. "It seems that there is a restriction associated with this passenger." The other employee, curious, glanced at the screen. "Restriction." He read over it and then let out a sigh, shaking his head. "It's that woman who was removed from the flight for disruptive behavior." The group of employees exchanged complicit glances. "So, what do we do with her suitcase?" The first employee shrugged. "Well, protocol is protocol." And that's how, without anyone having planned it, the outcome of the woman's saga was sealed. By airline rule, bags associated with passengers removed for inappropriate behavior cannot simply be handed back to the owner unless the person goes to the airport in person and goes through a new security process, which would include a complete new search and possibly a conversation with the airport police. "I'm sorry, sir," the official told Richard, "but we can't release the luggage to you. Your wife will need to claim it in person." Richard looked defeated. "But she's on the other side of the country." "Yes, sir. She'll need to book a flight here to retrieve it or pay to have it shipped back after going through additional security clearance." Maya, who had been listening, couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for Richard, if not for his wife. "That seems like a lot of trouble," she said. Richard nodded, a strange mix of emotions crossing his face: embarrassment, resignation, and perhaps a hint of something else. Relief. "It's not the first time something like this has happened," he admitted quietly, "but it might be the last." Now, while all this was going on at the final destination, we can only imagine the hell this woman was going through at the airport of origin. Because considering her behavior on the plane, it was obvious that she wasn't going to accept her expulsion without fighting to the last drop of toxic energy she still had in her body. "I will sue you," was undoubtedly something she had already shouted out loud at least 30 times to any official who was close enough to hear and regret being there. The airport staff were in a mixture of impatience and discreet amusement. None of them were in any hurry to resolve the situation. "Madam, as we have already explained, you were removed from the flight by decision of the crew and the security team. Any complaints should be made through the airline's official channels." "Official channels? I want to speak to the president of the airline right now." The employee smiled. "He's not available at the moment." "I'm a frequent customer. This is absurd." It was impossible to tell whether the woman was still shouting out of real indignation, or whether, at that point, she simply didn't know how to live without shouting anymore. And then came the final big blow. One of the employees received a notification on the system and looked at the woman with an almost perverse glint in his eyes. "Ma'am, we have an update on your luggage." The woman, who by now was so red she could have been used as an emergency beacon, gasped in exasperation. "Finally, where's my suitcase?" The clerk held back a smile. "It's at its final destination, but to pick it up, you'll have to go there in person and go through the security protocol." The pause that followed was delightful. The woman blinked. "I need to what?" "You'll need to take a new flight to retrieve your luggage." If there was any hope that she could calm down, it was crushed at that very moment. "Are you saying I need to pay for another flight?" The employee maintained a perfectly trained smile. "Yes, ma'am." The woman was shaking with hatred. "But this is your fault." "Ma'am, it was you who refused to follow the crew's instructions." The sentence was said with such calm that it had the effect of an invisible punch to her ego. And it was at that moment that the last shred of resistance inside her broke. She started shouting something incomprehensible, something between an insult and a curse, and marched away from the counter, probably to take her fury out on anyone random who happened to pass by. Meanwhile, on the other side of the country, the flight's passengers were already in their hotels, at home, or enjoying their destination. And her suitcase. Oh, it was still there, alone, waiting for its owner, who hopefully would never step foot on a plane from that airline again. Maya, her baby now fed and content, sat in the airport lounge waiting for her connection. Richard had offered to buy her a coffee as a small gesture of apology for his wife's behavior. "You know," Maya said, watching Richard stare into his coffee cup, "sometimes the universe has a way of showing us what we need to see." Richard looked up, his eyes tired but clearer than they had been on the plane. "I've been ignoring a lot of red flags for years," he admitted. "Watching everyone's reaction to her behavior today, it was like seeing her through fresh eyes." "What will you do now?" Maya asked. Richard took a deep breath. "I think when I get home, it's time for a long overdue conversation." As they parted ways, Maya with her baby heading to their gate and Richard to his hotel, a strange sense of closure hung in the air. What had started as a nightmare flight had somehow become a moment of reckoning, of boundaries being set, of consequences being faced. If there's one great lesson in all this, it's that the universe has a very special way of teaching humility to those who think they can do whatever they want without consequences. The woman wanted a seat that wasn't hers. She ended up with no seat, no flight, and no suitcase. She wanted to shout and make a fuss. She ended up being the joke of the day for at least 100 people who will never forget her. And the best part, she paid for it to happen.